The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Introduction. On February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Vane was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 1 degree south and longitude 107 degrees west. On January the 5th, 1888, that is 11 months and 4 days after, my uncle, Edward Pendrick, a private gentleman who certainly went abroad the Lady Vane at Callao, who had been considered drowned, was picked up in latitude 5 degrees south and longitude 101 degrees west, in a small open boat of which the name was illegible, but which is supposed to have belonged to the missing Signora Ipecatua. He gave such a strange account of himself that he was supposed demented. Subsequently, he alleged that his mind was a blank from the moment of his escape and Lady Vane. His case was discussed among psychologists at a time of a curious instance of lapsed memory consequent upon physical and mental stress. The following narrative was found among his papers by an undersigned, his nephew and heir, but unaccompanied by any definitive request for publication. The only island known to exist in the region in which my uncle was picked up is Noble's Isle, a small volcanic islet uninhabited, and was visited in 1891 by HMS Scorpion. A party of sailors had then landed, but found nothing living thereon except certain curious white moths, some hogs and rabbits, and some rather peculiar rats. So that this narrative is without confirmation of most essential particular, that with that understood, he seems no harm in putting his strange story before the public in accordance. As I believe, with my uncle's intentions, there is at least this much in its behalf. My uncle passed out of human knowledge about 5 degrees south and longitude 100 degrees east, and reappeared in the same part of the ocean after a space of 11 months. In some way he must have lived during the interval. It seems that a steward called upon the Icupuna with a drunken captain, John Davies, and did start from Africa with a puma and certain other animals abroad January 1887, that the vessel was known as several ports in the South Pacific, and that it had finally disappeared from those seas, with a considerable amount of copra abroad, sailing to its unknown fate in the Baina in December 1887, a date that tallies entirely with my uncle's story. Charles Edward Pendrick. Chapter 1. The Dingy of the Lady Vane. I do not propose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everyone knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out from Callao. The longboat, with 7 of the crew, picked up 18 days after HM gunboat Myrtle, and the story of their terrible privations has become quite known as a far more horrible Medusa case. But I have had to publish story of the Lady Vane, another possibly as horrible and far stranger. It has hitherto been supposed that the 4 men who were in the Dingy perished, but this is incorrect. I have the best evidence for this assertion. I was one of the 4 men, but in the first place, I must state that there were never 4 men in the Dingy. The number was 3. Constans, who was seen by the captain to jump into the gig, luckily for us and unluckily for himself, did not reach us. He came down and out to tangle up ropes and stayed the smash bowsprit. Some small rope caught his heel, and as he let go, he hung from a moment head downward, and then fell and struck a block of spar floating in the water. He pulled towards him, but he never came up. I luckily say, for us he did not reach us, and I might almost say luckily for himself, for he had only a small beaker of water and some sodden ship biscuits with us. So sudden had been the alarm, so unprepared the ship for any disaster. We thought the people on the launch would be better provisioned, though it seems they were not, and we tried to hail them. They could not have heard us. The next morning a drizzle cleared, and was not until past midday we could see nothing of them. We could not stand to look about us because of the pitching of the boat. The two other men who had escaped so far with me were a man named Helmar, a passenger like myself, a seaman whose name I don't know, a short, sturdy man with a stammer. We drifted famishing, and after water had come to an end, tormented by an intolerable thirst, for 8 days altogether. After the second day, the sea subsided slowly to a glassy calm, and it is quite impossible for the ordinary reader to imagine those 8 days. He has not, luckily for himself, anything in his memory to imagine with. After the first day, we said little to one another, and lay in our places in a boat which stared at the horizon, or watched, with eyes that grew larger and more haggard every day, the misery and weakness gaining upon our companions. The sun became pitiless. The water ended on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things, saying them to our eyes. But it was, I think, the 6th before Helmar gave a voice to the thing we had all been thinking. I remember our voices were dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another to spread our words. I stood out against it with all my might, was rather for scuttling the boat and perishing together among the sharks that followed us. But when Helmar said if his proposal was accepted we should have drink, the sailor came around to him. I not draw lots, however, and in the night the sailor whispered to Helmar again and again, and I sat by the bows with a clasp knife in my hand, though I doubt if I had stuff in me to fight. And in the morning I agreed to Helmar's proposal, and we handed halfpence to find the odd man. The lot fell upon the sailor, but he was the strongest of us and would not abide by it, and attacked Helmar with his hands. They grappled together and almost stood up, and I crawled along the boat to them, intending to help Helmar by grasping the sailor's leg. But the sailor stumbled and swang of the boat, and the two fell with a gunwale and rolled overboard together. They sank like stones. I remember laughing at that, and wondering why I laughed. The laugh caught me suddenly like a thing from without. I lay across the thwart for I did not know how long, thinking that if I had enough strength I would drink sea water and madden myself to die quickly. And even as I lay there, with no more interest than if I had been a picture, a sail came up towards me and over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember that it all happened quite distinctly. I remember how my head had swayed with the seas, and the horizon of the sail above it danced up and down. But I also remember as distinctly as I had a persuasion that I was dead, and I thought it was just a jest that what they say should come too late by such a little to catch in my body. For an endless period, as it seemed to me, I lay with my head on the thwart watching the schooner. She was a little ship, schooner rigged fore and aft, come out of the sea. She kept tracking to and fro in a winding compass, for she was sailing dead into the wind. It had never entered my head to attempt to attract attention, and I did not remember anything distinctly after the sight of her side until I found myself in a little cabin aft. There is a dim half-memory of being lifted up to the gangway, and a big round countenance covered the freckles and surrounded the red hair staring at me over the bulwarks. I also had a disconnected impression of a dark face, with extraordinary eyes, close to mine, but I thought it was a nightmare. Until I never met it again. I fancy I recollect some stuff being poured in between my teeth, and that is all. Chapter 2. The Man That Was Going Nowhere. The cabin in which I found myself was a small, rather untidy. A youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-colored mustache, and dropping nether lip was sitting and holding my wrist. For a minute we stared at each other without speaking. He had watery gray eyes, oddly void of expression. Then, just overhead came a sound like an iron bedstead being knocked out. About the low, angry growling of some large animal. At the same time the man spoke. He repeated his question. How do you feel now? I think I said I felt all right. I could not recollect how I had got there. He must have seen the question in my face, for the voice was inaccessible to me. You were picked in a boat, starving. The name on the boat was the Lady Vane, and there were spots of blood and gunwale. At the same time, my eye caught my hand, so thin that it looked like a dirty skin purse full of loose bones, and all the business of the boat came back to me. Have some of this, he said, and gave me a dose of some scarlet stuff, iced. It tasted like blood, and to me I felt stronger. You were in luck, he said, to get picked up by a ship with medical man abroad. He spoke with a slobbering articulation, with a ghost of a lisp. What ship is this? I said slowly, hoarse from my long silence. It's a little trader from Erica to Callao. I never asked where she came from in the beginning. Out of a land of born fools, I guess. I'm a passenger myself, from Erica. The silly ass who owns her, he's a captain too, named Davies. He has lost his certificate or something. You know the kind of man. Calls the thing Apixitua. Of all the silly, infernal names. Though when there's much of a sea without any wind, she certainly acts according. Then the noise overhead began again, a snarling growl and the voice of a human being together. Then another voice, telling some heaven-forsaken idiot to desist. You were nearly dead, said my interlocutor. It was a very near thing indeed, but I have put some stuff into you now. Notice your arm sore? Injections. You have been insensible for nearly 30 hours. I thought slowly. I was distracted now by the yelping of the number of dogs. Am I eligible for solid food? I asked. Thanks to me, he said. And now even the mutton is boiling. Yes, I said with assurance. I could eat some mutton. But, he said with a momentary hesitation, you know, I am dying to hear how you came to be alone in that boat. Damn, that howling. I thought I detected a certain suspicion in his eyes. He suddenly left the cabin, and I heard him in a violent controversy with someone who seemed to me talk gibberish in response to him. The matter sounded as though it ended in blows, in that I thought my ears were mistaken, as he shouted at the dogs and returned to the cabin. Well, he said in the doorway, you were just beginning to tell me. I told him my name, Edward Hendrick, and how I had taken to natural history as a relief from the dullness of my comfortable independence. He seemed interested in this. I had done science myself. I did my biology in University College, getting out the ovary of an earthworm with the radicula of a snail, and all that. Lord, it's 10 years ago. But go on, tell me about the boat. He was evidently satisfied with the frankness of my story, which I told in concise sentences enough, for I felt horribly weak. And when it was finished, he reverted once to the topic of natural history and his own biological studies. He began to question me closely about Tottenham Court Road and Grower Street, and is Capitalize still flourishing? What a shop that is! He had evidently been a very ordinary medical student, and drifted incoherently to the topic of music halls. He had told me some anecdotes. Left it all, he said, 10 years ago. How jolly it all used to be. But I made a young ass of myself, played myself out before I was 21. I dare say it's all different now. But I must look up to that ass of a cook and see what he's done to your mutton. The growling overhead was renewed, so suddenly with so much savage anger that it startled me. "What's that?" I called after him, but the door had closed. He had come back again with the boiled mutton. I was so excited by the appetizing smell that I almost forgot the noise of the beast had troubled me. After a day of alternate sleep and feeding, I was so far recovered as able to get from my bunk to scuttle and see green seas trying to keep pace with us. I judged the schooner as was running before the wind. Montgomery. That was the name of the flaxen-haired man. Came in again as I stood there and asked him for some clothes. He lent me some duck things of his own, for those I had worn in the boat had been thrown overboard. They were rather loose for me, for he was large and long in his limbs. He told me casually that the captain was 3 parts drunk in his own cabin. I assumed the clothes I had begun asking him some questions about the destination of the ship. He had asked the ship was bound to Hawaii, but then it had landed him first. "Where?" I said. "It's an island where I live. So far as I know, it hasn't got a name." He stared at me with his neither lip dropping. He looked so willfully stupid of a sudden that it came into my head that he desired to avoid my questions. I had the discretion to ask no more. Chapter 3. The Strange Face. We left the cabin and found a man at the companion obstructing our way. He was standing on the ladder with his back to us, peering over the combing of the hatchway. He was, I could see, a misshapen man, short, broad, and clumsy, with a crooked back, hairy neck, and head sunk between his shoulders. He was dressed in a dark blue serge and peculiarly thick, coarse black hair. I had heard the unseen dogs growl furiously, and forthwith he ducked back, coming into contact with the hand I put out to fend him off from myself. He turned with animal swiftness. In some indefinable way to back face thus flashed upon me, shocked me profoundly. It was a singularly deformed me, and facial part projected, forming something dimly suggestive of a mussel, and huge half-open mouth showed as big white teeth as I ever seen a human mouth. His eyes were some bloodshot at the edges, with a scarcely rim of white round hazel pupils. There was a curious glow of excitement in his face. "Confound you," said Montgomery. "Why the devil don't you get out of the way?" The black-faced man started aside without a word. I went up upon the companion, staring at him instinctively as I did so. Montgomery stayed at the foot for a moment. You have no business here, you know," he said in a deliberate tone. "Your place is forward." The black-faced man cowered. They won't have me forward. He spoke slowly, with a queer, hoarse quality in his voice. "Won't you have you forward?" said Montgomery in a menacing voice. "But I tell you to go." He was on the brink of saying something further, then looked up at me suddenly and followed me up the ladder. I had paused halfway through the hatchway, looking back, still astonished beyond measure at the grotesque ugliness of this black-faced creature. I had never beheld such a repulsive and extraordinary face before, and yet the contradiction is credible. I experienced at the same time an odd feeling that in some way I had already encountered the exactly features and gestures that now amazed me. Afterwards, it occurred to me that I had probably seen him as I was lifted abroad, and yet that scarcely satisfied my suspicion of a previous acquaintance. Yet how could have one set eyes on so singular a face had yet have forgotten a precise occasion past my imagination? Montgomery's movement to follow me released my attention, and I had turned and looked about me in the flush of deck of a little schnoor. I was already half prepared by the sounds I had heard for what I saw. Certainly, I had never beheld a deck so dirty. It was littered with scraps of carrot, shreds of green stuff, and indescribable filth. Fastened by the change of the mainmast were a number of grisly staghounds, who had now began leaping and barking at me, and by the mizzen of a huge puma was cramped on a little iron cage far too small even to give it turning room. Farther under the starboard bulwark were some big hutches containing a number of rabbits. A solitary llama was squeezed in a mere box of cage forward. The dogs were muzzled by leather straps. Only human beings on deck was a gaunt and silent sailor at the wheel. The patched and dirty spankers were tense before the wind, and up aloft the little ship seemed carrying every sail she had. The sky was clear, the sun midday down the western sky, long waves capped by the breeze with froth, were running with us. We went past the steersman to the half rail, and saw water come foaming under the stern and bubbles go dancing and vanishing in her wake. I turned and surveyed the unsavory length of the ship. "Is this an ocean menagerie?" I said. "It looks like it," said Montgomery. "What are these beasts for? Merchandise? Curios? Does the captain think he is going to sell them somewhere in the South Seas?" "It looks like it, doesn't it?" said Montgomery, and turned towards the wake again. Suddenly, we heard a yelp and a volley of furious blasphemy from the companion hatchway. The deformed man with a black face came up hurriedly, and he was immediately followed by a heavy, red-haired man in a white cap. At the sight of the former staghounds, who had all tired of barking at me by this time, became furiously excited, howling and leaping against their chains. The black hesitated before them, and gave them a red-haired man time to come up with him and deliver a tremendous blow between the shoulder blades. The poor devil went down like a felled ox, and rolled in the dirt among the furiously excited dogs. It was lucky for him that they were muzzled, and the red-haired man gave a yawp of exultation and stood staggering, as it seemed to me the serious danger of either going backwards down the companion hatchway towards of his victim. So soon the second man had appeared. Montgomery had started forward. "Steady on there!" he cried, a tone of remonstrance. A couple of sailors appeared on the forecastle. A black-faced man howling a singular voice rolled about under the feet of the dogs. No one had attempted to help him. The brutes did their best to worry him, butting their muzzles against him. There was a quick dance of their lithe, figured bodies over the clumsy, prostrate figure. The sailors forward shouted, as though it was an admirable sport. Montgomery gave an angry exclamation and went striding down the deck, and I followed him. The black-faced man scrambled up and staggered forward, going and leaning over the bulwark by the man's shrouds, where he remained panting and glaring over his shoulder at the dogs. The red-haired man laughed and a satisfied laugh. "Look here, Captain," said Montgomery with a lisp and accented, gripping the elbows of the red-haired man. "This won't do." I stood behind Montgomery. The captain came half round and regarded him with the dull, solemn eyes of a drunken man. "What won't you do?" he said, and added, after looking sleepily into Montgomery's face for a minute, "Blasted sawbones!" With a sudden movement, he shook his arms free, and after two ineffectual attempts, struck his freckled fist into his side pockets. "That man's a passenger," said Montgomery. "I'd advise you to keep your hands off him." "Go to hell," said the captain loudly. He suddenly turned and staggered towards the side. "Do what I like on my own ship," he said. I think Montgomery might have left him then, seeing the brute was drunk, but he only turned a shade paler and followed the captain to the bulwarks. "Look "You hear, Captain," he said. "That man of mine is not to be ill-treated. He has been hazed ever since he came abroad." For a minute, alcoholic fumes kept the captain speechless. Blasted sawbones! All he was considered necessary. Could see that Montgomery had one of those slow, pertentious tempers that will warm day after day with a white heat, and never again cool to forgiveness, and that I too saw this quarrel had been some time growing. The man's drunk, I said, perhaps offensively. "You do not know good." Montgomery gave an ugly twist to his dropping lip. He's always drunk. "Do you think that excuses his assaulting of his passengers?" "My ship," began the captain, waving his hand unsteadily toward the cages, "was a clean ship. Look at it now." It was certainly anything but clean. "Crew," continued the captain. "Clean, respectable crew. You agreed to take the beasts. I wish you'd never set eyes on your infernal island. What the devil want beasts for an island like that? Then that man of yours understood he was a man. He's a lunatic, and he had no business aft. Do you think the whole damn ship belongs to you? Your sailors began to haze the poor devils as soon as he came abroad. That's just what he is. He's a devil, an ugly devil. My men can't stand him. I can't stand him. None of us can stand him. Nor you either." Montgomery turned away. "You leave that man alone." "Anyhow," he said, nodding his head as he spoke. But the captain meant to quarrel now. He raised his voice. "If he comes this ship of the again, I'll cut his insides out, I tell you. Cut his blasted insides. Who are you to tell me what I'm to do? I tell you I'm the captain of this ship. Captain and owner. I'm the law here. I tell you, the law and the prophets. I bargained to take the man of his attendant to and from Arica and bring back some animals. I never bargained to carry the mad devil with a silly sawbones. Well, never mind what he called Montgomery." I saw the latter take a step forward and interposed. "He's drunk," I said. The captain began to abuse even fouler than the last. "Shut up," I said, turning on him sharply, for I had seen the danger in Montgomery's white face. With that I brought the downpour on myself. However, I was glad to advert that it was uncommonly near a scuffle, even at a price of the captain's drunken ill will. I do not think I have ever heard quite so much vile language come out in a continuous stream from any man's lips before, though I have frequented eccentric company enough, for I have found it somewhat hard to endure, though I am a mild-tempered man. But certainly, when I told the captain to shut up, I had forgotten that I was merely a bit of human flotsam, cut off by resources of my fare unpaid, a mere casual dependent on the bounty nor speculative enterprise of the ship. He reminded me of it with considerable vigor, but with any rate I prevented a fight. Chapter 4. At the Schneer's Rail. That night land was sighted after sundown, and the Schneers hove to. Montgomery intimated that it was his destination. It was too far to see any details. It seemed to me that then simply a low-lying patch of dim blue and uncertain blue-gray sea. An almost vertical streak of smoke went up from it into the sky. The captain was not on deck when it was sighted. After he had vented his wrath on me, he staggered below, and I understood that when he went to sleep on the floor of his own cabin, the mate practically assumed the command. He was the gaunt, the taciturn individual we had seen on the wheel. Apparently, he was very in an evil temper with Montgomery. He took the slightest notice of either of us. We dined with him in a sulky silence. After few effectual efforts on my parts to talk, it struck me too that the man regarded my companion of animals in a singularly unfriendly manner. I found Montgomery a very reticent about his purpose with these creatures, and about his destination, and though I was sensible of growing curiosity as to both, I did not press him. We remained talking the quarter deck until the sky was thick with stars, except for an occasional sound in the yellow-lit forecastle with the movement of animals now and then. The night was very still. The puma lay crouched together, watching us in the shining eyes, a black heap in the corner of its cage. Montgomery produced some cigars. He talked to me of London in a tone of half-painful reminiscence, asking all kinds of questions about changes that had taken place. He spoke like a man who had loved his life there, and had suddenly and irrevocably cut off from it. I gossiped as well as I could of this and that. All the time, the strangest of him was shaping itself in my mind. As I talked, I peered at his odd, pallid face in the dim light of a binnacle lantern behind me. Then I looked out at the darkling sea, where in the dimness of his little island was hidden. This man it had seemed to me, had come in and out of immensity merely to save my life. Tomorrow he would have dropped over by the side and vanished again out of my existence. Even had it been under the commonplace circumstances, it would have made me trifle thoughtful. But in the first place, it was a singularity of an educated man living in an unknown little island, coupled with the extraordinary nature of his luggage, and found myself repeating the captain's question. What did he want with the beast? Why, too, had he pretended they were not when I remarked about them first? Then again, in his personal attendant, there was a bizarre quality which had impressed me fondly. These circumstances threw a haze of mystery around the man. They lay in my hold of imagination and hampered in my tongue. Toward the midnight talk of London died away. We stood side by side, leaning over the bulwarks and staring dreamily over the silent, starlit sea, and each pursuing of his own thoughts. It was the atmosphere for a sentiment, and I began upon my gratitude. If I must say it, I said, after a time, you saved my life. Chance, he answered, just chance. I prefer to make my thanks to the accessible agent. Thank no one. You had need. I had the knowledge, and I injected to fed as much as I might have collected a specimen. I was bored and wanted something to do. If I had been jaded that day, or hadn't liked your face, well, it's a curious question where you would have been now. This damped my mood a little. At any rate, I began. It's a chance, I tell you, he interrupted, as everything in a man's life, only the asses won't see it. Why am I here now, an outcast from civilization, instead of being a happy man enjoying all the pleasures of London? Simply because of 11 years ago I lost my head for 10 minutes on a foggy night. He stopped. Yes, I said. That's all. We relapsed into silence. Presently he laughed. There was something in this starlight that loosens one's tongue. I'm an ass, yet somehow I would like to tell you. Whatever you tell me, I may rely upon keeping it to myself, if that's it. He was on point of the beginning, and then he shook his head doubtfully. Don't, I said. It is all the same to me. After all, it is better to keep your secret. There is nothing gained but a little relief if I respected your confidence. If I don't, well... He grunted undecidedly. I had felt him at a disadvantage, had caught him in the mood of indiscretion, and to tell the truth, it was not curious what might have driven the young medical student out of London. Have an imagination. I shrugged my shoulders and turned away. Over the taffrail, leaned to silent black figure, watching the stars. It was Montgomery's strange attendant. and looked over its shoulder quickly with any movement, and then looked away again. It may seem a little thing to you, perhaps, but it came like a sudden blow to me. The only light near us was a lantern at the wheel. The creature's face was turned for one brief instant out of dimness in the stern towards the illumination, and I saw the eyes of the glance that shone at me with a pale green light. I did not know what the reddish luminosity, at least, is uncommon to the human eyes. The thing came to me as a stark of inhumanity. The black figure of its eyes of fire struck down through all my adult thoughts and feelings, and for a moment the forgotten horrors of childhood came back to my mind. Then the effect past had come, an uncouth black figure of a man. The figure, of no particular import, hung over the taffrail against the starlight. I had found Montgomery was speaking to me. "I'm thinking of turning it in, then," he said, "if you have enough of this." I answered him incongruously. He went below, and he wished me good night at the door of my cabin. That night I had some very unpleasant dreams. The waning moon rose late. Its light struck a ghostly white beam across my cabin and made an ominous shape of planking to my bunk. Then the staghounds woke and began howling and baying, so that I dreamt fitfully and scarcely slept until the approach of dawn. Chapter 5. The Man Who Had Nowhere to Go. In the early morning, it was the second morning after my recovery, and I believe the fourth after I was picked up, I awoke through the avenue of tumultuous dreams of guns and howling mobs, and became sensible of a hoarse shouting above me. I rubbed my eyes and lay listening to the noise, doubtful for a little while of my whereabouts. Then came a sudden pattering of bare feet, and sound of heavy objects being thrown about, a violent creaking and rattling of chains, and heard a swish of water, and the ship was suddenly brought round, and foamy yellow-green waves flew across the little round window and left it streaming. I jumped into my clothes and went on deck. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky, for the sun was just rising, the broad back of hair and of the captain, and over his shoulder the puma spinning, the tackle rigged on the mizzen spanker boom. The poor brute seemed horribly scared, and crouched in the bottom of his little cage. "Overboard with him!" bawled the captain. "Overboard with him! We'll have a clean ship soon after, the whole bilin' of 'em." He stood away, that I had the preforce to tap his shoulder to come on deck. He came round with a start, and staggered back a few paces to stare at me. It needed no expert eye to tell that the man was still drunk. "Hello!" he said steadily, and then a light coming into his eyes. "Why, it's a Mr. Pendrick," I said. "Pendrick! Be damned," he said. "Shut up! That's your name, Mr. Shut Up!" It was no good answering the brute, but I certainly did not expect his next move. He held out his hand in the gangway by which Montgomery stood talking to a massive gray-haired man in the dirty blue flannels, who had apparently just come abroad. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut Up! That way!" roared the captain. Montgomery and his companion turned as he spoke. "What do you mean?" I said. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shut Up! That's what I mean! Overboard, Mr. Shut Up! And sharp! We're cleaning the ship out! Cleaning the whole blessed ship out! And overboard you go!" I stared at him, dumbfounded. Then it occurred to me that it was exactly the same thing I wanted. I lost the prospect of a journey, and the sole passenger of his quarrelsome sot did not want to mourn over. I turned towards Montgomery. Can't you, said Montgomery, his companion, concisely. "You can't have me," I said, aghast, and he had the squarest, most resolute face I had ever set eyes upon. "Look here," I began, turning to the captain. "Overboard," said the captain. "This ship ain't for beasts and cannibals worse than beasts anymore. Overboard you go, Mr. Shut Up. If they can't have you, you goes overboard. But anyhow you go with your friends. I've done this blessed island evermore. Amen. I've had enough of it." "But Montgomery," I appealed. He distorted his lower lip and nodded his head hopelessly, and gray-haired man beside him to indicate his powerlessness to help me. "I'll see you presently," said the captain. Then began a curious three-concerned alteration. Alternately, I appealed to one and another of the three men. First to the gray-haired man to let me land, and then the drunken captain to keep me aboard. I even bawled entreaties to the sailors. Montgomery never said a word, and only shook his head. "You're going overboard, I tell you," was the captain's refrain. "Law be damned! I'm king here. I must confess my voice suddenly broke in the middle of the vigorous threat. I felt a gust of hysterical petulance, and went aft and stared dismally at nothing. Meanwhile, the sailors progressed rapidly through the task of unshipping and the packages and caged animals. The large launch, 2 standing lugs, lay under the lee of the schooner, and into the strange assortment of goods were swung. I did not see the hand of the island that were receiving the packages, for the whole of the launch was hidden from the side of the schooner. Neither Montgomery nor his companion took the slightest notice of me, but beside themselves and assisting and directing the 4 of 5 sailors who were unloading the goods. The captain went forward, interfering rather than assisting. I was alternately despairful and desperate. Once or twice I stood waiting for the things to accomplish themselves. I could not resist the impulse to laugh at my miserable quandary. I felt the wretched for a lack of breakfast. Hunger and lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man. I perceived pretty clearly that I had not the stamina either to resist what the captain chose to expel me, or to force myself upon Montgomery and his companions. So I waited passively upon fate, and the work of transferring Montgomery's possessions to the launch went as if I did not exist. Presently that work was finished, and then came a struggle. I was hauled, resisting weakly enough, to the gangway, even though I noticed the oddness and brown faces of the men who were with Montgomery in the launch. But the launch was now fully laden, and shoved off hastily. The broadening gap of green water appeared under me. I pushed back with all my strength to avoid falling headlong. The hands in the launch shouted diversely, and I heard Montgomery curse at them, and then the captain, the mate, and one of the seamen helping him. He ran aft toward the stern. The dinghy of the Lady Vane had been towing behind, and it was half full of water, had no oars, and quite unvictuallated. I refused to go aboard her, and flung myself full length on the deck. In the hand, swung into the rope, for they had no stern ladder, and they cut me adrift. I drifted slowly from the schooner. In a kind of stupor, I watched all the hands take the rigging, and slowly but surely came round to the wind. The sails fluttered and bellied out as wind came to them. I stared her weather-beaten side steeply towards me, and then she passed out of my range of view. I did not turn my head to follow her. At first I could scarcely believe what had happened. I crouched at the bottom of the dinghy, stunned, staring blankly at the vacant, oily sea. Then I realized that in that little hell mine again, now half swamped, and looking back over of a gunwale, I saw the shore standing away from me, with the red-haired captain mocking at me over the taffed rail, and turning toward the island saw the launch growing smaller as he approached the beach. Abruptly, the cruelty of this desertion became clear to me. I had no means of reaching land unless I could chance to drift here and there. I was still weak, you must remember, from my own exposure in the boat. I was empty and very faint, or I should have had more heart. But as it was suddenly began to sob and weep, as I had never done since I was a little child, the tears ran down my face. In a passion of despair, I struck my fists at the water of the bottom of the boat and kicked savagely at the gunwale. I prayed aloud for God to let me die.